Sarah Martinez had always been different from the other soldiers in her unit. While her fellow Marines joked and laughed during downtime, she sat quietly in the corner, methodically cleaning her rifle and studying maps. Her hands never shook, her breathing never quickened even during the most intense training exercises. This calm demeanor should have earned her respect, but instead it made her fellow soldiers suspicious. Ice Queen, they called her behind her back. Staff Sergeant Johnson was particularly harsh in his criticism. "Martinez freezes up when the pressure's on," he told anyone who would listen. "Mark my words, when bullets start flying for real, she'll crack like an egg." The whispers followed her everywhere. During mess hall conversations, training exercises, and late-night discussions in the barracks, the same theme emerged. Sarah was too quiet, too controlled, too detached. Real combat required passion, aggression, and quick emotional responses, they argued. Her methodical approach to everything made them nervous. Sarah had joined the Marines 3 years earlier, driven by a desire to serve her country and prove herself in a male-dominated field. Growing up in rural Montana, she had learned to hunt with her grandfather, developing an exceptional eye for long-distance shooting. Her recruitment scores were outstanding, particularly in marksmanship, but her personality clashed with military culture. During advanced sniper training at Camp Pendleton, Sarah consistently outperformed her classmates. She could hit targets at distances that amazed even the instructors. Her breathing techniques were flawless, her calculations precise, and her patience unlimited. Yet somehow, these strengths were viewed as weaknesses by her peers. "She's like a robot," complained Corporal Davis after Sarah had once again achieved perfect scores during a particularly challenging exercise. Real snipers need instinct, not just technical skill. When the enemy is shooting back and your buddies are dying around you, you can't just sit there doing math. The criticism stung, but Sarah never showed it. She continued her training with the same quiet determination that had carried her through childhood. Her grandfather had taught her that true strength came from inner calm, not outward bravado. "The loudest dog in the pack is usually the most afraid," he used to say. Her company commander, Captain Williams, saw potential in Sarah that others missed. He had served in 3 combat deployments and recognized that different situations required different types of soldiers. While he never publicly defended her against the criticism, he made sure she received the advanced training she needed. As their deployment to Afghanistan approached, the negative talk intensified. During pre-deployment briefings, soldiers openly questioned whether Sarah would be reliable under fire. Some even suggested she should be reassigned to a support role rather than remain with the combat unit. Sarah listened to all of this without responding. She spent her final weeks before deployment studying the terrain maps of their assigned region, memorizing distances between key landmarks, and practicing with different wind conditions. While others partied and tried to forget about the upcoming danger, she prepared methodically for every possible scenario. The night before they left for Afghanistan, Sarah sat alone on her bunk, writing a letter to her grandfather. She thanked him for teaching her patience and precision, qualities that had shaped her entire approach to life. She promised him that no matter what happened overseas, she would remember his lessons about staying calm under pressure. As she sealed the envelope, she could hear her squad mates in the next room, still discussing their doubts about her reliability. Tomorrow they would all board a transport plane together, heading toward a conflict zone where their theories about combat would be tested against harsh reality. Sarah folded the letter carefully and placed it in her personal effects. She had spent 3 years listening to predictions about her failure. Soon she would have the chance to prove whether her critics were right or wrong. Deep down, she felt ready for whatever challenges awaited them in the mountains of Afghanistan. The heat hit them like a wall when they stepped off the transport plane at Forward Operating Base Chapman. Afghanistan was everything the veterans had warned them about and worse. The air was thick with dust, the smell of diesel fuel, and something else Sarah couldn't quite identify but learned later was the constant presence of danger. Their first weeks involved routine patrols through local villages, establishing relationships with tribal leaders, and learning the complex landscape of the Kunar province. Sarah adapted quickly to the environment, but her squadmates continued their skeptical observations of her behavior. During their 3rd week, they encountered their first real firefight. The patrol was moving through a narrow valley when insurgents opened fire from elevated positions. Bullets whistled overhead as the Marines dove for cover behind rocks and abandoned vehicles. "Martinez, take that ridge," shouted Sergeant Johnson. pointing toward a rocky outcrop about 800 meters away. "We need suppressing fire on those positions." Sarah moved smoothly to her designated position, set up her rifle, and began methodically identifying targets. While chaos erupted around her, she remained completely focused on her scope. One by one, she eliminated the enemy shooters with precise, calculated shots. When the firefight ended 20 minutes later, the insurgents had retreated, leaving behind several casualties. Sarah's performance had been flawless, but instead of praise, she received more suspicious looks from her teammates. "Did you see how calm she was?" whispered Private Chen to Corporal Davis. "It's not natural. Everyone else was pumped up on adrenaline, but she was like she was at target practice." The criticism puzzled Sarah. She had performed exactly as trained, neutralized multiple threats, and helped end the engagement quickly. Yet somehow her competence under fire was seen as evidence of something wrong with her character. Staff Sergeant Johnson pulled her aside after the patrol returned to base. "Your shooting was good out there, Martinez," he said grudgingly. "But I'm still not convinced you've got what it takes when things really go south. That was just a small skirmish. Wait until you're in a real battle where your friends are dying and everything's falling apart." Over the following months, Sarah participated in dozens of patrols and several significant operations. Each time, she performed with the same steady competence that had characterized her training. She never panicked, never made emotional decisions, and never failed to hit her targets. Yet the doubts about her persisted. The other Marines developed various theories about her unusual calmness. Some thought she was secretly terrified but hiding it well. Others believed she lacked normal human emotions and couldn't truly understand what they were fighting for. A few even suggested she might crack completely when faced with a truly desperate situation. During quiet moments at the base, Sarah often reflected on these criticisms. She wondered if there was something wrong with her approach to combat. Maybe her grandfather's lessons about staying calm weren't applicable in modern warfare. Perhaps effective soldiers did need to feel fear and anger to perform their best, but deep down she knew her methods worked. Her kill count was higher than anyone else in the company. She had never missed an important shot or failed to complete an assigned mission. Her teammates were alive partly because of her steady performance under fire. The real test of her abilities came during a reconnaissance mission in the remote mountains near the Pakistani border. Intelligence reports suggested a high-value target was meeting with local insurgent leaders in a village called Baramulla. Sarah's unit was assigned to observe the meeting and report back to headquarters. They established an observation post on a ridge overlooking the village, about 1,500 meters from the target building. For 2 days, they watched through binoculars and spotting scopes, documenting the movements of suspected insurgents. On the second night, everything changed. A larger group of militants arrived in the village, including several men carrying advanced weapons and communication equipment. Captain Williams decided they needed to get closer for better intelligence gathering. "Martinez, Johnson, take Chen and Davis down to that valley position," he ordered, pointing to a location about half the distance from their current spot. "We need positive identification on some of these new arrivals." As they moved to the new position under cover of darkness, none of them realized they were walking into a carefully planned trap. The insurgents had known about their observation post all along, and were using the meeting as bait to draw the American soldiers into a vulnerable position. Sarah felt uneasy as they approached the new location. Though she couldn't pinpoint exactly why, something about the terrain didn't feel right, and the normal sounds of the mountains seemed muffled. Her grandfather had taught her to trust her instincts, even when logic couldn't explain them. But she kept her concerns to herself, not wanting to give her critics more ammunition about her being unreliable or overly cautious. The ambush began at dawn with a thunderous explosion that threw dirt and rocks 50 feet into the air. The insurgents had planted an improvised explosive device directly in the path Sarah's team would take to their observation position. The blast was perfectly timed to catch them in the open, far from any natural cover. Private Chen was closest to the explosion. The shockwave lifted him off his feet and slammed him against a boulder. Sarah, who had been walking point, was knocked unconscious by flying debris. When she came to 30 seconds later, her ears were ringing and blood was trickling from a cut on her forehead. Automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions around them. The insurgents had planned this ambush carefully, positioning shooters on the high ground to create a crossfire that would trap the Americans in a deadly zone with no escape routes. Sergeant Johnson was shouting orders, but Sarah could barely hear him over the ringing in her ears. Corporal Davis was dragging the wounded Chen behind a large rock that provided minimal protection. Bullets were striking all around them, sending chips of stone flying through the air. "We're pinned down," Johnson yelled into his radio, trying to reach the main unit. "Need immediate support. We've got wounded." But the radio crackled with static. The mountains interfered with communications, and their main unit was too far away to provide quick assistance. They were alone, outnumbered and trapped in terrain that favored their attackers. Sarah shook her head to clear the fog from the explosion and assessed their situation. The insurgents held the high ground on 3 sides, with at least a dozen shooters maintaining steady fire on their position. Chen was unconscious and bleeding from multiple wounds. Their small rock formation provided cover from some angles but left them exposed to others. "Martinez," Johnson called out.
"Can you see where they're shooting from?"
Sarah carefully peered around the edge of their cover, using her training to identify muzzle flashes and estimate distances. The enemy positions were well chosen, located on ridges and behind natural barriers that made them difficult targets for conventional weapons. The closest insurgent position was about 400 meters away, but the shooters there had the best angle on the Americans' hiding spot. Every few seconds, bullets struck near their position, keeping them pinned down and preventing any attempt to move to better cover. "I count 12 separate positions," Sarah reported, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "They've got us surrounded on 3 sides. The closest group is on that ridge to the northwest." Johnson cursed under his breath. Their standard assault rifles were effective up to about 300 meters under ideal conditions, but the enemy positions were too distant and too well protected for accurate return fire. They needed heavier weapons or air support, neither of which was immediately available. Davis was working frantically to stop Chen's bleeding, but the private's condition was deteriorating rapidly. He needed medical attention that none of them could provide in their current situation. Every minute they remained pinned down decreased his chances of survival. "Base, this is Patrol 7. Johnson spoke into his radio again. "We need immediate extraction and medical support. 1 critical wounded, surrounded by superior numbers." The response was broken and barely audible through the static. Something about air support being unavailable due to weather conditions and ground reinforcements being at least 2 hours away. Johnson's face went pale as he realized they were truly on their own. The insurgents seemed to understand the Americans' predicament. Their fire became more systematic and patient, designed to keep the soldiers trapped rather than overwhelm them immediately. They could afford to wait, knowing that time was on their side. Sarah studied the enemy positions through her rifle scope, calculating distances and wind conditions automatically. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her about patience and precision under pressure. This was exactly the kind of situation he had prepared her for during those long hunting trips in the Montana wilderness. But the ranges involved were extraordinary, even by military standards. The farthest insurgent positions were nearly 3,000 meters away, well beyond the effective range of her standard-issue rifle. Even with her exceptional skills, attempting shots at such distances would be considered impossible by most military standards. As bullets continued to strike around their position, Sarah made a decision that would either save her teammates or confirm every criticism that had ever been made about her judgment under pressure. She began methodically planning shots that would challenge every principle of conventional marksmanship. The first thing she needed was a better position, one that would give her clearer sightlines to the distant targets, while providing some protection from the closer shooters. About 50 meters to their east, she had spotted a natural depression in the ground that might work, but reaching it would require exposing herself to enemy fire. "Johnson," she called out quietly, "I need to move to that depression over there. Can you and Davis provide covering fire?" Johnson looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "Are you crazy? You'll be cut to pieces before you make it 10 meters. Sarah ignored Johnson's protests and began preparing for her dangerous move to the new position. She checked her equipment methodically, ensuring her rifle was properly zeroed and her ammunition was easily accessible. Every movement was deliberate and calm, despite the bullets continuously striking around their location. "Listen to me," she told Johnson firmly. "Chen is going to die if we stay here much longer. Air support isn't coming and reinforcements are hours away. I can take out those shooters, but I need a better angle." Johnson stared at her in disbelief. "Martinez, those positions are over 2 miles away. Nobody makes shots like that in combat. "This isn't a shooting range." "Trust me," Sarah replied simply. She had never asked for trust before, had never demanded anything from her teammates. But something in her voice made Johnson pause. Davis looked up from treating Chen's wounds. "She's right about one thing, Sarge. Chen's losing too much blood. If we don't break this ambush soon, he's not going to make it." The weight of leadership pressed down on Johnson's shoulders. Every instinct told him that Sarah's plan was suicidal, but their alternatives were running out quickly. The insurgents had them perfectly positioned for a slow, methodical elimination. "Okay," Johnson said finally, "but we do this my way. Davis and I will lay down covering fire and you sprint to that depression. No heroics, no fancy moves, just run straight and fast." Sarah nodded and prepared herself for the sprint. She stripped off unnecessary equipment, keeping only her rifle, ammunition, and essential gear. The 50-meter dash would take her directly across the enemy's line of sight, exposing her to fire from multiple positions. "On my count," Johnson said, readying his rifle. 3, 2, 1, go! Sarah exploded from behind their cover as Johnson and Davis opened fire on the closest insurgent positions. Bullets immediately began tracking her movement, striking the ground inches from her feet as she ran. The sound of automatic weapons filled the air, creating a deadly symphony around her sprinting form. She dove into the depression just as a burst of gunfire tore through the space where she had been running. Rolling to absorb the impact, she immediately began setting up her shooting position, while dirt from near-miss bullet impacts showered down around her. The new position gave her clear sight lines to the distant enemy locations, but also exposed her to return fire from multiple angles. She would have perhaps 30 seconds to make her shots before the insurgents adjusted their fire to her new location. Through her rifle scope, Sarah began identifying targets systematically. The mathematics of extreme long-range shooting filled her mind automatically. Wind speed and direction, air density, bullet drop compensation, and the rotation of the earth itself. Her grandfather had taught her these calculations during their hunting trips, though he had never imagined she would use them at such extraordinary distances. The first target was a machine gun position on a ridge nearly 2,800 meters away. Through her scope, she could see the muzzle flashes and estimate the shooter's exact location behind a natural rock barrier. The range was far beyond what military manuals considered feasible for her weapon system. Sarah controlled her breathing, allowed her heart rate to slow, and began the mental calculations that would determine whether her teammates lived or died. Wind speed was approximately 8 miles per hour from the northwest. Air temperature was rising as the morning sun climbed higher. The target was at a significantly higher elevation than her position. All of these factors would affect her bullet's trajectory during the nearly 3-second flight time to the target. One small miscalculation would result in a complete miss and expose her position to concentrated enemy fire. She made minute adjustments to her rifle's scope settings, compensating for the extreme range and environmental conditions. Her breathing became completely controlled, each inhale and exhale timed to minimize any movement of her weapon. The first shot rang out across the mountain valley, echoing off the rocky walls and announcing her position to every insurgent in the area. For 3 long seconds, time seemed suspended as the bullet traveled its impossible trajectory toward the distant target. Through her scope, Sarah watched as the machine gunner suddenly pitched forward and disappeared behind the rocks. The automatic fire from that position immediately stopped. "Holy shit," Davis shouted from their original position. "Did you see that shot?" But Sarah was already acquiring her second target, another machine gun position approximately 2,900 meters to the northeast. The insurgents would now be looking for her location, trying to spot the sniper who had just eliminated their teammate from an impossible distance. Return fire began impacting around her depression, but the enemy shooters were still trying to locate her exact position. She had perhaps 15 seconds before they coordinated their fire effectively enough to force her to move again. The second shot followed the same methodical process: breathing control, environmental calculations, and minute scope adjustments. This target was slightly farther away and positioned behind better cover, making the shot even more challenging. When her rifle fired the second time, Sarah was already moving to acquire a third target before confirming the hit. Through peripheral vision, she saw the distant muzzle flashes stop, indicating another successful elimination. The insurgents' fire pattern was beginning to change as they realized the threat they were facing. Instead of the patient, coordinated ambush they had planned, they were now dealing with a sniper capable of reaching them at ranges they had considered safe. The insurgents' tactical situation was rapidly deteriorating, and they knew it. Sarah's impossible shots had eliminated their two most effective machine gun positions, breaking the carefully planned crossfire that had kept the Americans pinned down. Panic was beginning to replace their initial confidence. From her depression, Sarah could hear urgent shouting in Pashto as the enemy fighters tried to coordinate a response to her long-range fire. Some were attempting to relocate to positions that might be safer from her incredible shooting ability, while others were desperately trying to spot her location for counter-sniper fire. But Sarah was far from finished. Through her scope, she identified a command position where several insurgents were clustered around what appeared to be radio equipment. The group was located on a high ridge approximately 3,100 meters from her position, a distance that would challenge even the most advanced military sniper systems. The wind had picked up slightly, adding another variable to her already complex calculations. At this extreme range, even a small change in wind speed could cause her bullet to miss by several meters. She observed dust patterns and the movement of vegetation to estimate the wind's effect on her bullet's 3-second flight path. Johnson and Davis were maintaining sporadic fire on the closer positions, but they were conserving ammunition and primarily trying to keep the remaining insurgents focused on their original hiding spot rather than searching for Sarah's new location. "Martinez," Johnson called out over the sound of gunfire. "Whatever you're doing, keep it up." "They're starting to break formation." Sarah made her scope adjustments and prepared for what would be her most challenging shot yet. The target was partially concealed behind a rock outcropping, giving her only occasional glimpses of the enemy fighters when they moved to use their radio equipment. She waited patiently, controlling her breathing and heart rate while watching for the perfect moment. Patience had always been one of her greatest strengths, and it was particularly crucial for extreme long-range shooting. Rushing a shot at this distance would guarantee a miss. The opportunity came when one of the insurgents stood up to get better radio reception. For approximately 2 seconds, he was fully exposed in Sarah's scope. She squeezed the trigger smoothly, following through with perfect shooting form that her grandfather had drilled into her thousands of times. The shot felt perfect as it left the barrel. Sarah immediately began tracking her next target, while the bullet traveled its long arc toward the distant ridge. When the insurgent suddenly collapsed, the other fighters around the radio position scattered in terror. Word was spreading among the remaining insurgents that they were facing a sniper with supernatural abilities. The distances involved were so far beyond normal combat ranges that many of them couldn't believe what was happening. Some began abandoning their positions entirely, retreating toward escape routes they had prepared before the ambush. But Sarah wasn't finished. She had identified 7 more positions that needed to be eliminated before her teammates would be safe enough to move. Each shot required the same methodical process, the same perfect execution of skills she had developed over years of practice. Her 4th target was a sniper position approximately 2,700 meters away, where an insurgent with a scoped rifle was attempting to locate and eliminate her. This was perhaps the most dangerous remaining threat, as a skilled enemy marksman might be able to reach her position with accurate fire. The counter-sniper duel lasted nearly 10 minutes, with both shooters trying to locate each other while remaining concealed from return fire. Sarah eventually spotted a brief reflection from the enemy's scope and made a perfect shot that ended the threat permanently. With each successful elimination, the remaining insurgents became more desperate and less coordinated. Their carefully planned ambush was collapsing under the pressure of Sarah's impossible marksmanship, and they were beginning to understand that their positions were not as safe as they had believed. By this point, Sarah had fired 12 rounds and achieved 11 confirmed kills at ranges between 2,400 and 3,100 meters. Each shot had been more difficult than anything covered in her military training, requiring her to push the boundaries of what was considered possible with her weapon system. The remaining insurgents were now focused entirely on escape rather than completing their ambush. Sarah could see groups of fighters abandoning their positions and moving toward predetermined retreat routes in the higher mountains. But one position remained active, and it was the most dangerous of all. A heavy machine gun emplacement had been constructed on the highest ridge, approximately 3,200 meters from Sarah's location. The crew had reinforced their position with sandbags and natural rocks, creating a nearly impregnable fortress that commanded the entire valley. This position had not participated heavily in the initial ambush, instead remaining in reserve to prevent the Americans from escaping or to eliminate any rescue attempts. But now it represented the final obstacle between Sarah's team and safety. The range was at the absolute limit of her rifle's capabilities. At 3,200 meters, her bullet would take over 3 seconds to reach the target and would drop nearly 200 feet during its flight. Wind compensation would be critical, as even a slight miscalculation would cause a complete miss. Sarah studied the position carefully through her scope, looking for any weakness in the heavy fortifications. The machine gun crew was well disciplined and experienced, keeping most of their bodies protected behind cover while maintaining their weapons' effectiveness. She would have one opportunity for a perfect shot. If she missed, the heavy machine gun would immediately focus its fire on her position, making any follow-up shots impossible. The success of her entire rescue effort depended on this single, impossible shot across more than 3 miles of mountainous terrain. Sarah lay motionless in her depression, studying the distant machine gun position with the patience of a predator. The range was 3,247 meters according to her calculations, farther than she had ever attempted to shoot in her life. The mathematics involved were staggering, requiring her to account for variables that most snipers never encountered. At this distance, the Earth's rotation would actually affect her bullet's trajectory. The Coriolis effect, normally ignored at shorter ranges, became a significant factor that could cause a miss measured in meters rather than inches. Her grandfather had mentioned this phenomenon during their advanced shooting lessons, though he had admitted he'd never seen it applied in practical situations. The wind patterns were complex at such extreme range. Surface winds near her position were light and variable, but the bullet would encounter different wind conditions at various altitudes during its flight path. She observed dust patterns, cloud movements, and vegetation on distant ridges to estimate how the wind might affect her shot. Through her scope, she watched the machine gun crew with professional interest. They were experienced fighters who understood proper tactical positioning. Most of their bodies remained protected behind sandbags and natural rock barriers, exposing only what was necessary to operate their weapon effectively. The gunner himself was visible only when he leaned forward to sight through his weapon or communicate with his assistant. These exposures lasted mere seconds and occurred at irregular intervals, making timing crucial for any shot attempt. Sarah's ammunition supply was running low after her previous eliminations. She had exactly 3 rounds remaining, which meant she could afford at most 1 practice shot to confirm her calculations. But a practice shot would immediately reveal her position to the machine gun crew, eliminating any element of surprise. She decided to trust her calculations and attempt the shot without confirmation. This was the kind of decision that would either validate years of training or confirm every criticism her teammates had made about her judgment under pressure. The environmental conditions were gradually changing as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky. Air temperature was rising, which would affect air density and bullet trajectory. Humidity was increasing as well, adding another variable to her already complex calculations. Sarah made final adjustments to her rifle scope, dialing in corrections for the extreme range, environmental conditions, and the Earth's rotation. The adjustments pushed her scope to its maximum settings, operating at the very limits of what the equipment was designed to handle. Her breathing became completely controlled as she settled into her final shooting position. Every aspect of her body position was optimized for the shot. Bone support, muscle relaxation, and perfect alignment between her eye, the scope, and the target. Through the scope, she waited for the perfect moment when the machine gunner would expose himself sufficiently for a clear shot. The wait stretched on for several minutes, testing her patience and concentration while enemy bullets continued to impact around the general area of her teammates. The opportunity finally came when the gunner rose slightly to clear a jam in his weapon. For approximately 2 seconds, his upper torso was visible in Sarah's scope. The target area was roughly 18 inches wide, a reasonable target at normal ranges but incredibly small when viewed across more than 3 miles. Sarah's trigger squeeze was perfect, developed through thousands of hours of practice and refined by months of combat experience. The rifle's recoil was familiar and comfortable, and she maintained perfect sight picture throughout the shot process. Time seemed suspended as the bullet began its long journey across the mountain valley. 3.25 seconds, longer than most people could hold their breath comfortably. During that time, wind could shift, the target could move, or any of 100 other variables could cause a complete miss. Sarah remained in position, watching through her scope as the impossible shot traveled toward its target. She had done everything humanly possible to ensure accuracy. The rest was beyond her control, dependent on physics, mathematics, and perhaps a small amount of luck. The machine gun position fell silent immediately. Through her scope, Sarah could see that the gunner had collapsed behind his weapon. The assistant gunner was frantically trying to determine what had happened, looking in all directions except toward Sarah's position over 3 miles away. For a moment, the entire battlefield seemed to pause in recognition of what had just occurred. Even the other insurgent fighters stopped shooting, apparently stunned by the elimination of their strongest position from an impossible distance. Johnson's voice broke the silence from their original position. "Martinez, did you just take out that heavy gun?" "Confirmed," Sarah replied calmly, already scanning for any remaining threats. "The position is neutralized." The psychological effect of Sarah's shooting was immediate and devastating to the remaining insurgents. Their most secure position had been eliminated by a shot they couldn't even comprehend. Panic spread through their ranks as fighters began abandoning their positions en masse. Within minutes, the ambush had completely collapsed. The surviving insurgents were retreating into the high mountains, abandoning equipment and wounded comrades in their haste to escape from the supernatural sniper who could reach them anywhere. The valley fell quiet except for the sound of wind through the rocks and the distant voices of fleeing fighters. Sarah's impossible 3-mile shot had broken the back of the insurgent ambush and saved her entire team from certain death. The silence that followed Sarah's final shot was profound and unsettling. After hours of continuous gunfire, the sudden quiet seemed almost unnatural. Sarah remained in her shooting position for several minutes, scanning the distant ridges through her scope to confirm that the insurgents had truly retreated. "All clear," she finally called out to Johnson and Davis. "They're gone." Johnson emerged cautiously from behind their original cover, still unable to fully process what he had witnessed. Sarah's performance had been so far beyond normal combat standards that it challenged everything he thought he knew about warfare and human capability. Sarah collected her equipment methodically and moved back to rejoin her teammates. Her movements were calm and deliberate, showing no signs of the adrenaline rush that typically followed intense combat. To an outside observer, she might have just finished a routine training exercise rather than executed the most difficult shots of her military career. Davis was still working frantically to stabilize Chen's condition, but the private's breathing had become more labored during the firefight. They needed to get him to medical facilities immediately, something that had been impossible while pinned down by the ambush. "Base, this is Patrol 7. Johnson spoke into his radio with newfound urgency. "Ambush has been neutralized. We need immediate medical evacuation for one critical casualty." The response came back clearer now that they weren't surrounded by enemy interference. A medical helicopter was already en route to their location, having been dispatched when the initial ambush report came through. Estimated arrival time was 15 minutes. As they prepared Chen for evacuation, Johnson found himself looking at Sarah with completely different eyes. The quiet, methodical soldier he had criticized for months had just demonstrated capabilities that seemed to belong in military legends rather than real combat. "Martinez," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." "Hell, we all do." Sarah checked her rifle and began cleaning it with the same methodical attention she always showed her equipment. "No apology needed, Sergeant. We all did our jobs today." But Johnson knew it was much more than that. Sarah hadn't just done her job. She had performed feats of marksmanship that would be discussed in military circles for years to come. Her impossible shots had saved all of their lives and demonstrated skills that redefined what was possible in combat situations. The sound of helicopter rotors grew louder as their extraction approached. Davis had managed to stabilize Chen enough for transport, though the private remained unconscious and would need immediate surgery once they reached the medical facility. As the medical helicopter landed in a cloud of dust and noise, Sarah helped load Chen onto a stretcher. Her hands were steady, her demeanor unchanged by the morning's events. To her, the extraordinary shooting had been simply the application of skills she had developed over years of practice and training. The helicopter crew chief looked at the four Marines with professional interest. "We heard there was some kind of sniper engagement out here. Command wants a full debrief as soon as you get back to base." During the flight back to Forward Operating Base Chapman, Johnson sat across from Sarah, studying her profile as she looked out at the mountain landscape below. He thought about all the criticism she had endured, all the predictions about her failure under pressure, all the doubts about her emotional fitness for combat. Word of Sarah's incredible shooting had already reached the base before their helicopter landed. Groups of Marines gathered around the landing pad, eager to hear details about the engagement that had required shots at ranges most of them considered impossible. Captain Williams was waiting for them as they unloaded from the helicopter. His expression was serious, but there was unmistakable pride in his eyes as he looked at Sarah. "Martinez, I need you in the briefing room in 30 minutes. Division Intelligence wants to hear about this engagement directly from you." Over the following days, Sarah's story spread throughout the military community in Afghanistan and beyond. Her 3,247-meter shot was officially verified and entered into military records as one of the longest confirmed sniper kills in combat history. Military training programs began studying her techniques and mental approach to extreme long-range shooting. The criticism and doubts that had followed Sarah throughout her military career evaporated overnight. Instead of questioning her emotional fitness for combat, her fellow Marines began seeking her advice on marksmanship and mental preparation. The same qualities that had made them suspicious, her calmness, methodical approach, and emotional control, were now recognized as the foundation of her extraordinary abilities. Staff Sergeant Johnson, who had been her harshest critic, became one of her strongest advocates. During debriefing sessions, he openly admitted his previous misjudgments and praised Sarah's performance under the most extreme pressure imaginable. "I was wrong about Martinez," he told Captain Williams during a private meeting. "I thought combat required emotion and aggression, but she proved that precision and mental discipline are just as important. Maybe more important, Private Chen survived his injuries and made a full recovery at the military hospital in Germany. When he returned to active duty 3 months later, he sought out Sarah immediately to thank her personally for saving his life. The conversation was brief. Sarah was never comfortable with praise, but Chen's gratitude was genuine and heartfelt. Sarah continued her deployment in Afghanistan with a new reputation that preceded her wherever she went. Other units began requesting her assistance for difficult missions that required exceptional marksmanship skills. She participated in several more operations, though none required shots quite as challenging as her record-breaking 3,247-meter elimination. When her deployment ended 8 months later, Sarah returned to the United States as a decorated combat veteran, with commendations for valor and exceptional marksmanship. Military training commands invited her to share her techniques with advanced sniper schools, and her methods became part of official curriculum. But for Sarah, the recognition felt less important than the validation of her grandfather's teachings. The patience, precision, and mental discipline he had instilled in her during their hunting trips in Montana had proved invaluable in the most challenging situation of her life. During her post-deployment leave, she visited her grandfather at the family ranch where she had first learned to shoot. He was older now, his hands not as steady as they once were, but his eyes still held the same calm intensity that had shaped her character. "I heard about what you did over there," he said simply as they sat on the porch watching the sunset over the Montana mountains. Sarah nodded, unsure how to summarize the complex emotions surrounding her combat experience. The shot that had made her famous was just one moment in a longer story about finding her place in an organization that had initially rejected her approach to warfare. "Your grandmother would have been proud," he continued. "She always said the quietest waters run the deepest." As Sarah prepared to return to active duty, she reflected on how completely her military career had been transformed by that single engagement in the Afghan mountains. The Marines who had once questioned her reliability now sought her mentorship. The institution that had criticized her emotional detachment now celebrated it as a tactical advantage. More importantly, she had proven to herself that her grandfather's lessons about patience and precision were not just applicable to hunting deer in Montana forests, but to the most challenging and dangerous situations she might ever face. The girl who had been called Ice Queen for her calm, demeanor had become a Marine legend whose story would inspire future generations of military marksmen. Her impossible 3.247-meter shot had not only saved her battalion that day, it had forever changed how the military understood the relationship between emotional control and combat effectiveness. Sarah Martinez had finally found her place in the Marines, not by changing who she was, but by proving that who she had always been was exactly what her country needed when it counted most.